And so the pacing of Magic feels very deliberate in a similar way that chess feels deliberate. You have one action per turn. You have one mana per turn in Magic. But Magic can have this build-up and accumulation of resources that at some point can bubble over and become overwhelming.
Distraction makers.
So we've gotten a few comments that are asking us to discuss resource systems. What are the implications of having one type of resource system over another?
Yeah.
We have sort of settled on the fact that like a resource system is the pacing of your game.
At a minimum.
At a minimum.
Pacing, yes.
It can tell other stories too, which we'll get into. But really, I mean, the resource system is really the heart of the way that your story is going to unfold in the game.
I think that...
and by story, I mean like Ludo narrative, like the mechanical story that is being told with the systems of your game.
Yeah. And we can talk a little about the Ludo narrative that's told through different resource systems in games. But I think that what's not really emphasized enough in game design is that games only exist when there is, I should say, orthogonally driven games, which is a game with a quantifiable end, an end state. So that would be Magic the Gathering. That would be chess. That'd be, many 1v1 games, but more than that. They need an objective / goal, and they need some form of resource management. Mm-hmm. It's not that they need resource management. It's that it's an inevitability of a game.
So we could even go as simple as possible and talk about tag, right? Tag is probably one of the best examples of one of the most simple games. You have a goal, which is tag the other person, and you have a resource system, which is literally your physical stamina.
Right.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's a game.
And you could get into, tactics of tag and all that, but beyond that, it's just that is the game at its core.
That is the system.
And you are able to abstract that into turn-based games, and chess is another simple example where the goal is obviously checkmate the opponent's king. Your resources are a mixture of your one action that you have per turn, and the pieces that are on the board. These games have to have this. And depending on how you introduce these resources, like chess would be a much different game if pieces were added onto the board as opposed to removed from the board. And it would tell a much different type of a story and have a much different type of pacing.
Chess is interesting to start with in particular because chess tells a story of diminishing resources. You are at your most powerful piece-wise at the beginning of the game, and then position-wise as time has gone on and you've used your one action per turn, you might be in a more commanding position, but you might not be as powerful as having all of your pieces, right? You will have lost some of them theoretically.
Yeah.
And that, is sort of an abstract of a battle or something, right? Where you start with a certain number of units on a field and they dwindle over time. But if we look at Magic tells a story of growing resources. It's not completely linear in its growth, but it is, if it's normalized, it's one per turn. But Magic also has the ability to stumble, right? To miss a mana, to miss a land drop, and it introduces variance into the gameplay. And so the pacing of Magic feels very deliberate in a similar way that chess feels deliberate. You have one action per turn. You have one mana per turn in Magic. But Magic can have this build-up and accumulation of resources that at some point can bubble over and become overwhelming. And we see this most obviously in the Commander format, in that Commander incentivizes this kind of style of gameplay. You have a lot of health, you have a lot of time to build up your resources, and so turn after turn, you have exponential growth of your resources. You can use your resources to acquire more resources, till ultimately you can overwhelm your opponents.
Right. And it's a common thing that you'd see in other games. I mean, you look at something like Settlers of Catan, and it's a very similar structure, right? Where you're starting with a certain amount of settlements, and over time, you will get resources either via trade or via collecting them based off of where your settlements are located. Then you will use those resources to build other settlements that will then allow you to generate more resources. That game, that is its primary thing. That's its way of achieving the victory condition. But I think what's really interesting, and what a lot of people end up sort of debating and talking about online, is the difference between Magic's mana system and a steady, consistent growth of one mana per turn. And I think a lot of people have sort of taken up the assumption or decided that that is an idealized version of mana because it removes the mana screw that you might get from not drawing a land on your turn when playing a game of Magic. And I think we have a video that we've kind of talked about a defense of Magic's mana system. I don't actually remember if we talked about this particular thing in it.
Yeah, it adds the ability for you to sort of stumble, right? So I think in that video, we liken it to the difference between something like tennis versus something like football, where football gives a lot more variance in terms of how many players on the field, that any one of them could make a mistake, where tennis, it's like, well, one player makes a mistake, and that just scores you a point.
Right.
So Magic, on the other hand, when you're able to sort of stumble on these resources, it creates opportunities for your opponent to capitalize on. Sometimes it's the whole game, which is, maybe a detriment.
Which happens. And I think that's why so many people do end up disliking it and moving towards these other sort of resource systems that usually use a card as in hand as a resource or something like that. But I think that what's really interesting is, and what not enough people, I think, consider or give credit to Magic for doing this, is that not having a consistent curve of mana, and also understanding that putting mana in your deck and having that drawn takes away from your other possibilities in your deck when you're deck building, creates this interesting not only tension in the deck construction, but also in the game itself.
In the gameplay, in the strategy.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you end up drawing, I'll use an example of if I'm drawing seven cards starting hand, and I'm playing mono red rush. I feel like I always use mono red rush because it's
the easiest example.
Cool. That's what I'll say. Definitely.
Everybody who's played Magic understands what it is, but you can briefly explain.
Definitely not, because that's all I've been playing lately. But so yeah, if you do that and I draw one red mana, one red land, I'm looking at my hand, and even though I could cast all these spells over the next couple of turns, I won't have a lot of gas to keep going. So there's this tension, there's this risk. I have to understand what is the possibility, what's the payoff, and what's the potential detriment if I don't draw a land in the next 2 turns or whatever.
Right. Well, basically where each card in your hand you want to be the equivalent of 3 damage, but some of those cards in your hand have to be a land so that you can play the other cards that deal the 3 damage.
Right.
And you don't want to draw too many lands because then you're not drawing enough cards that deal damage, and you don't want to draw too few lands because then it's going to take you too long to kill your opponent.
Right. And I think what's interesting about that is that the majority of the time, I'd say your average opening hand in a game of Magic, you probably want 2 to 3 lands as a general heuristic, I suppose. But if you are leaning towards the 2 lands, you have this moment where you're okay, I have to know my deck well enough to know that the probability of me getting this land is how impactful is that going to be? Is that going to be the thing that stops me from winning or doesn't, or allows me to win? I don't know.
Our discussion on mana systems or resource systems is at its most interesting when we're contrasting it with other games.
Yeah.
So let's stick with TCGs for now, but we're going to get into some video game resource systems a little later. But for now, let's talk about the difference in pacing between Magic and, say, something like Yu-Gi-Oh, right? Where Yu-Gi-Oh's resource system is there, but just barely. What is so fascinating to me, and I think, again, I commented on this in the Yu-Gi-Oh video, but it helps me to understand the perspective of a Yu-Gi-Oh player who comes to Magic and feels wow, there's not a lot happening here. Because in Yu-Gi-Oh, I'm playing a million cards, I'm drawing cards, I'm summoning stuff. My whole turn is super swingy, and I've blown up all my opponent's stuff, and I'm attacking them, and then back on their turn, they're playing stuff and attacking me. The action economy is still part of this thing that we're talking about. And the pacing and the story that Yu-Gi-Oh is telling is much more fast-paced than what Magic ends up being.
Yeah. And even older Yu-Gi-Oh play, because it does have this system where you can only have one normal summon.
Sure.
There wasn't as much of an emphasis on having all these different monsters coming out on your turn and having these huge swingy turns. And so I think that was a feeling that they leaned into as they got further into the game and started developing around their system that they constructed.
Well, it makes sense to differentiate yourself in that way, right? If you're trying to carve a niche for yourself in a market, you would look at your competitors, Magic and Pokemon at the time, and you're like, well, how do we do something different than what they're doing?
Right.
Well, if our pacing is just way faster than them, we feel way more exciting than they do.
Right.
So it makes sense. So let's talk about Digimon for just a minute.
Yeah. Just a minute. Only a minute?
Only a minute.
Okay.
So why don't you explain how the Digimon system works?
I would love to. So Digimon's system ends up working that you have a memory gauge that both players share the resource of. And so I don't remember if it starts at 0 or at 1 for the player that ends up starting the game, but basically the minute that you go over the 0 that's in the center, it goes from 10 to 0 back to 10 on the other person's side. The minute you pass that middle line, that ends your turn. In the majority of cases, system-wise, ends your turn, and now whatever you've spent past that 0 is how much mana, resources, your opponent has on their turn.
So they get like additional resources based on what you played.
Yes. And so if, for instance, you had 3 resources to spend before you reach 0, you technically could spend 13 resources because you could spend all the way up to 10 to your opponent's turn, as long as you don't pass the 0 between them. You couldn't spend like 5 and then spend 8, because the 5 would bring you over the 0, officially ending your turn.
Right.
So, but if there was a card that costs 13 to play, you could just play that card.
And then you're maxed it out.
And then your opponent has the potential to play up to 20.
20 is the most
20 is the most you could
energy you could have.
Memory.
Yeah. Right. Sorry. Right.
We played this, man.
I
But this, I think when this came out, is a very unique resource system. Honestly, biggest selling point of the game. I think it's a great way of playing the game. Tournament play, very exciting. And I think that it's an interesting way of sort of solving like mana screw of not being able to do anything. So much so that they actually didn't have mulligans for a long time. Now I think they have a mulligan system finally. But I think they saw the consistency in you being essentially able to play any card that is up to 10 memory on your first turn.
Right.
But it's
pretty wild.
It's pretty wild. And what's really exciting is, like, I remember drawing a hand in a tournament, and I drew my like the big guy for my deck, right? He's the biggest thing that I would ideally want to save up for and build up. And I could play him and drop him turn 1 if I wanted. And I was like, I don't know if this is smart, but it's either that or I give my opponent like 5 memory, which they could do quite a bit with. So instead, I'd rather give them this huge thing they have to respond to. And it paid off like immensely. And so I was like, oh, that's like really cool that I could essentially decide to risk it all, give them this huge amount to try and spend, and see if they can do something with that.
Sort of like you either have it or you don't kind of situation. It's interesting. I'm curious about, first of all, I think it is kind of a way to get that bombasticness of Yu-Gi-Oh! By still having, and still have some kind of guardrail.
Some constraints, yeah.
Yeah, so that you're getting that back and forth. But yeah, I mean, we might need to do it. We'll do a deeper dive in Digimon at some point.
Yeah, we got him. We got him.
Look. Sure, whatever. So let's get to the video game side of things real quick. So when we're looking at a resource system in a video game, I think, again, Elden Ring, as we always talk about. Elden Ring's stamina system, I think, is particularly interesting here in telling a compelling story through its resource system.
Yeah.
I like to talk about how Souls-likes are simulating what is known as the dance, which is a sword fight, like a ancient medieval sword fighting terminology in terms of the way that longsword fighting works. Right, it's you'll circle each other, move in, move out.
Right, it's constant back and forth of someone being the aggressor and someone sort of being in a submissive reactionary. Yeah.
Right, and when we look at Elden Ring and its stamina system, the stamina system enables this to be to feel like that kind of an encounter, where you have a particular amount of stamina, you can go in and you can attack only so many times before you are left completely vulnerable. If you go in and you overcommit, and then you don't have enough stamina to even dodge what your opponent, in this case the AI, is going to do to you, and you end up, taking way more damage than you should.
So yeah, I mean, when you look at like other action RPGs, a lot of the times they don't opt for a stamina system. A lot of the times, if the feeling you're trying to get is someone that's just like badass,
a power fantasy.
It's a power fantasy, right? You're trying to show just how strong the players can be, and so you don't often end up having these sort of stamina bar restrictions. I think for a while those existed in some games, but I think what people ended up sort of opting for is instead animation locking. And so instead of committing a move or your time to something and then having like a dwindling bar, it's essentially as long as you have the opportunity of doing a particular thing, you can do it. But once you're committing to a move, that's the move you're doing. Yeah. So if you're playing God of War, a lot of the times, like you might have a bar that's going up that allows you to then do a bunch of crazy moves and you get really, really strong and you can start punching a bunch of people. I don't remember. It's called like Rage Meter or something. So you could have that, but for the most part, your move set is Kratos is going to go and he's going to be swinging his axe, but it takes 1 to 2 seconds to do that animation. And while you're doing that, you can't do something else. So enemies could potentially hit you, attack you as you're committing to this particular thing. Also, the space is limitation. So Kratos, when he gets his blades, he has a big AoE thing. But otherwise, for the most part, it's very single target heavy.
Sure.
Or like cone effects.
Well, and comparing and contrasting the rage idea, I think is interesting, right?
Yeah.
And that
it's flipping it.
Right. It's sort of taking the stamina thing and flipping it the other way around, and that like attacking begets more attacking, right? So you, as long as you're sort of building up this thing, you're becoming more and more powerful.
Right.
Where in Elden Ring, as soon as you start striking your opponent, that's when you're at your most powerful and become weaker as you're fighting. And these two systems feel like polar opposites of each other, right? Elden Ring feels much more deliberate. It feels much more like the dance, where when we look at something like God of War, we're creating a power fantasy.
Right.
And in a lot of ways, that can be likened to chess versus something like Yu-Gi-Oh! Maybe, right? Like that is what these design decisions about your resource system can change about your game in terms of the story that you're telling.
Right. And it doesn't mean that any one is better or worse than the other. It just means that you are expressing something different through these resource systems. But what's interesting is, I think, liking this to something like God of War versus Elden Ring, very clear differentiation of power fantasies, very similar sort of systems or structures. Mm-hmm. You are not limited necessarily in the same ways that you're limited with Elden Ring as you are with God of War. But I think a lot of people can lump a lot of these genres together and say like, well, that's an RPG or that's an action RPG. So, but even something as small as just a differentiation with how you attack tells a vastly different story and experience.